Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Book Leads Impactful Books for Life and Leadership. I'm your series host and leadership performance coach, John Jaramillo. This podcast series is about getting to the books that have impacted the lives and the businesses, the work of my networks and colleagues. And these are great leads that I'll be interviewing to get to those books that have made the most difference in their work, their life, their business. All those worlds intersect. In the course of the series, I cover three categories of books. The first book is one they're sharing with me that I haven't read. The second category is one that we've both read, whether specifically for the episode or in our past lives. The third category is when I speak to an author and or publisher about the message of the book that they want to get out there into the public. So today I have somebody that is soon to be an author in the coming months, and he had reached out about discussing his book that's coming out then. But I asked him, based on the work that he's doing now, to come on. And my guest today is Sean Stewart. And Sean is a seasoned historian, leadership consultant, and business trainer with over 30 years of experience in studying and working in the history field. Sean's multifaceted expertise in history, sailing, and storytelling enables him to connect people with our shared human experience across millennia. Sean has been dedicated to unveiling the power of history to transform our present perspectives and inspire positive change. As a historical leadership excellence expert, he guides managers into becoming effective leaders by leveraging the lessons of the past. Sean's use of artifacts and compelling narratives serves as a powerful tool to illuminate history and shape cohesive, high-performing teams. Now, again, I had mentioned Sean's got a book coming out. Sean, is it later this summer, in the fall?
Yes, it should be. It'll be ready. It's actually finished now, so it's just in the editing phase to get it up to scrap, and then we'll be ready to go.
So Sean had reached out on LinkedIn. You know how LinkedIn is. You always forget how you connect with people, but you engage with common connections, see each other's names, see each other's comments, connect that way. Sean had reached out to share the message of his upcoming book on this series. We got to talking. I learned about the work that it is that he does through history, through the lessons that you can bring forward. I found that fascinating. I said I'd be game for a conversation on his book when it comes out, but that in the meantime, we could cover any books or a book that he wants to cover that has influenced him, that he sees the value in. So here we are, and I'm glad that he's joining me. Sean, thank you for being here.
Thanks for the invite, John.
So, Sean, who are you today? Can you provide a little more? It was a great bio, a little more of the work that you're doing today in the day-to-day, just to get a sense of who you are and the work that you're doing.
Sure. From the day-to-day, I'm still working primarily as a historian and sort of seminar leader. I'm currently based in Berlin, so I lead daily walks, but they're sort of seminars on legs, is what I like to say. And I bring forth the key issues in the last 100 and 150 years, and we discuss them. So, for example, today we had a 2-hour discussion on the politics of memory, commemorating the history of the First and Second World War. To what extent it's still relevant, ought we still to be doing it, what's the value in it, who is it aimed at, and so on. So I get people together and we visit some monuments here in Berlin, where I'm currently based in Germany, and we discuss the issues that are brought out. So that's what I do for the day job. And for the leadership sphere, I'm sort of transferring those lessons that I've learned from studying history for all these decades and bringing it to the modern office in the corporate world, so that people can benefit from our sort of shared human experience, as I like to put it.
So what does that look like in terms of the work when you're utilizing the lessons of the past of history to work with leaders and managers of the corporate worlds or organizations today? What is it, one-on-one coaching? I'm assuming maybe seminars, much in the same way you do with your walking seminars.
Right.
Is it one-on-one coaching, group coaching, workshops?
It's all of those. So one-to-one coaching is the most common, I suppose, or one-to-small group is the most common. But also workshops. I'm leading one next month, for example, for a group of C-suite executives, and we're using a couple of large objects from the past to illuminate topics around cohesion and the necessity of cohesion. So the way I sort of went into this was noticing, from working with corporate people when I was living in Moscow, primarily, I noticed that the problems that they have in their life, they would bring to me and we would discuss them. And I noticed that they would plunk for these quite complex solutions, theoretical based, techniques to help them. And I said, we've sort of been here as a species already. Like, the problem you're having feels unique, but actually we've been here before. And so have you tried this? Or what about that? And you sort of, engage in a discussion with them. And over the course of a few years, I realized that approach actually is something that people really quite liked. They liked the thing I like about it as well is that by abstracting your problem a little bit and sort of taking 10 steps back and looking at some issue from 1,000 years ago, it gives you perspective, and you're able to see the issues more clearly. So when you come back into your current issue, having discussed the past, you feel invigorated. You feel like you're not alone, as silly as that might sound. Like you're not alone here. We've been here before, and this is how it worked out. And so the way I ended up doing it was to present these things through artifacts, through archaeology artifacts, and I sort of infused those artifacts with sort of essential leadership messages. And the artifacts act as a sort of aid memoir. So when it's one of the problems I think in any of these corporate spheres that we have today, is that the trainer will come in and they'll present some idea, and then it's a case of in one ear and out the other. Like 2 weeks later, people have forgotten the training and they just go back to status quo ante. So the way that I use the artifacts is to encourage people to buy a copy of them, or at the very least put a picture of them somewhere in their office. And by having it constantly in view, the lesson is constantly in view, right? So for example, I just happened to have by chance, I was talking to somebody yesterday about this. I have here with me a 1915 trench whistle. If you can see that on the camera. This is a object that British officers used in the First World War. And it was used as a signal to go over the top. And so this was blown. It had an enormous range, over a kilometer. And then the men would go over the top and assault the German trenches. And what's interesting is that the person who blew the whistle, the leader, who had a bigger salary and ate better food and had better accommodation, all the privileges of rank, this person was sharing in the immediate dangers of his people. And this is something that's missing, I think, in the modern leadership world, where you have two sort of standards, I think. For example, I remember reading about a story recently where a person had started a company and got it to the point where it had about 50 employees. But the individual was quite interested, if we could put it that way, with his own prestige as the leader. And this person had acquired tickets to the final game of some big sporting event. And before that, he had been demanding that these people come in, and work 12 hours and 15 hours, just squeezing them like a lemon, right? And then he came in one day and said, hey, I've got these tickets because I'm a high and mighty person, and aren't I special and wonderful? I'm leaving at 12 o'clock. Basically, see you guys, and I expect you to work and finish the project while I go off and enjoy the fruits of my, prestige as the leader. So unsurprisingly, the person went, and within the next month, half the staff ended up walking out, by and by. And you think, okay, well, surely a better example of leadership would be to say, look, you guys all know how much I love the sports team, but to thank you for doing this, I will raffle these tickets off to one of you, and you go, and then I'll stay. And that gesture, even though you're going to lose these prize tickets, that gesture to your team will stick in their mind for years, because essentially you're sharing the risks and you're sharing the rewards, and you're not putting yourself first. You're serving through your leadership, acts as a service to the team, not the other way around. So, you put something like this trench whistle there, which reminds you that as the leader, you share the dangers and the risks with your team. You don't make them do all the work and you go off and enjoy all the privilege. And, it's a case of a month later, 2 months later, it's a simple object. It's hanging there on your chair, and you're faced with a situation like the one faced by this guy. And you just look at the object, you glance at it and think, and it's like, oh, I really want to go to the game, but I think I'm going to make it. And if that's all it does is trigger that memory, then you've made a decision which is going to have positive ramifications, long beyond having gone to that game or whatever it is that we're looking at. So that's it. And you can embed multiple lessons in these things as well, John. So for example, this trench whistle was developed from the Bobby whistle of the 19th century, the London police whistle. And when you think about what the purpose of that whistle was, a policeman found a criminal, and he's blowing it, and what he's doing is asking for help. So however skilled of a detective he is, however skilled of a policeman he is, he can't be afraid to ask for help when he needs it. Right? And this is a problem that a lot of small business owners face. They feel like they're the ones who, through the dint of their own work and through dint of their hard labor, they have all the answers and only they can solve the problems, and asking for help is a sign of weakness. But in fact, it's quite the opposite. Like a professional will blow the whistle when they need the assistance, because as a professional, they know that they need assistance. So this is the sort of things you're taking these essential leadership lessons and coding them into these objects, placing the object in your office, and then basically engaging in a dialogue with it as the months and years go by. So it's like
I
a
love
silent
that.
coach, you know. So
I love that. And I love what you brought up before about somebody being able to take 10 or 15 steps back, looking at their issue through the lens of history, that we've seen this before, you know, the lessons of the past, repeating them, and so on and so forth. Because I find that most of the issues we have, I know for me, when I hear somebody else has that issue, there's that commonality. When you feel like you're the only one that's experiencing it because you haven't looked around, you haven't asked, you haven't been curious about other people's experience, but you're suffering in your own whatever it is, if it's very isolating. You feel like there's something wrong with you. I mean, for instance, the last couple of years in sharing about my anxiety, the more people share about theirs, it's like, okay, this isn't just me. This is something that happens to many people. I can learn about it. There's this burden gets taken off of your shoulders because it's
right,
not just you. And then the
right,
other piece that you mentioned that I think is incredible and I love seeing is when you see a leader that's really in the trenches with their people. Whatever that looks like in the corporate world today, with their arms, with their sleeves rolled up, they're in the front, they're asking questions. Who's got the best ideas right now? It's not, you know, you figure this out and come to me when you have a solution. They jump in there and lead by example. So I think those are two very amazing examples and just points that you've made so far.
Well, thanks, John. I think the other thing as well about the trench example is that when the British officers blew the whistle, don't forget the Germans could hear it as well. And those machine gunners knew exactly where to point their gun before the guy stuck his head above the trench. They knew, they could hear where it's coming from. So a leader is willing to take the bullet for their team. I mean, that's just another, again, you're having to use the metaphor there for what that looks like in the corporate world. But everybody in that regiment knew that the leader was taking the biggest risk by blowing the whistle. And
yeah, and
that's
when
how
you
the
see
British
that,
army was cohesive. I mean, that army won because they remained cohesive. And that was one of the reasons why they remained cohesive, because the people could see that the leader was willing to do that.
yeah, when you see that, it's rare, but when you see it play out, it's amazing to watch.
Yeah.
You know, here's this person that is serving the people. You know, speaking to somebody just recently on this series about soldiers, and if you were in charge of the soldiers, you ate last because you had to make sure that they were taken care of, because you know, but it's just amazing to see. And you know, when you see it, you know when it's real, you know when it's authentic, when they are taking care of their people. And some people may say, oh, you know, that's too soft, you got to be strong, you got to be at the head of the pack. There's just so much in there about the fear that you may have, so you have to build up this facade and beat your chest, versus the humility and the vulnerability of just saying, you know, I blowing the whistle, I need help. Like, to me,
Yep.
that saves time. I don't want you pretending you have all the answers. If you need help, it's on you to say you need help, and we'll be here for you.
Right. And that's why they had the policemen were issued whistles, because that was I mean, imagine, I tell people, you know, imagine you're the commissioner of police, right? And your star agent had found the perpetrator, but then because, you know, this person had, you know, they wanted to get all the glory to himself and to, you know, to capture, and, you know, the killer gets away. So are you so high and mighty now? All you had to do was blow the whistle to let your other team members know where you were.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you, for those people who really get into the chest banging side of it, just ask yourself, I mean, was Sherlock Holmes a loser for asking for help? He had his Watson by his side this whole time. He had one of these police whistles. You know, you just look at those and say, well, no, of course not. He was clever because he knew when to ask for help.
Yeah.
So, you know, exactly.
Sean, to understand how you ended up here, I'm always fascinated with someone's past. So beginning at when you took your first steps into your career, whether education, workforce, whatever those few steps were, can you kind of walk me through your career, the high points, the major steps you took to get to the work, to get to that focus of where you are now?
Sure. I knew from an early age that I didn't want to have a traditional career. So I was always interested in history, and I was always interested in the past. And the trick was to, I learned, I'm going to say it's from the early 90s when I was 20 or even a teenager, that you have to go and find the story, and you have to go to where the story happened and played out. So what I did in my early years was just find a way to make that possible. So that ended up being through teaching. And then as I became a teacher, I realized I actually quite like it, and I just simply taught on the sites. So I spent 14 years in Moscow studying Stalinism. I lived 2 years in Japan studying the Japanese Empire. Now I'm living in Berlin, doing the First and Second World War eras in the DDR. I was in charge of the southwest of England for their interpretation. So Stonehenge and Tintagel Castle, where King Arthur was from, I did the interpretation and the signage for those places. So you have to go to where the story is, basically, learn about it, settle down, and then find a way to teach people and make it relevant. And the more I did that, the more it became about the world that we live in today, rather than purely the past for its own sake, right?
Where are you originally from, Sean?
Chicago.
Okay.
So I left, I suppose I already had started leaving by the 80s, and then I made my more or less permanent move out in the early 90s.
So you went from high school straight overseas, or did you go to college domestically?
I went to, I did my bachelor's in the United States, although I did some of it in Italy, and then finished it in the United States. And then I did my first master's in Scotland in St. Andrews in history and archaeology, and then the second one in England on historical interpretation. So so I have sort of one leg on either side of the ocean in terms of educational styles is concerned.
Where did that curiosity for the story, to getting to where the story comes from, paraphrasing what you said, where does that come from? Did you see that in family, in your community? Where was that completely innate, where just, out of the womb you were just kind of curious? What was it that led you down that path of wanting to get to the story, whatever it may be?
There wasn't a moment. That's the interesting thing, at least from my perspective. There wasn't some kind of, Damascus moment where I had an aha. It's, I remember, vague and distant memories. You go to a place, and, when I was a kid in the 80s, and my father took me to Gettysburg, and we got one of those little, the mini balls, the 3-ring mini ball, the musket ball. And, the person who sold it in the shop said, oh, this is original from the time period. And, I suppose it was at that time. I didn't know any better. But I felt like I sort of had some essence of that experience contained within the object. Like the object had some little echo of the event. And it was like I was bringing it home. And so that story went from over there, which was impossibly far from Chicago, 800 miles away. Now it's over here. It's in my drawer. Wow. I've essentially felt like I became a little part of the story by having this object, within reach. So I have those sorts of dim memories from but it just sort of grew organically, I suppose. I just kept following the story, and I still am doing that today.
Sean, so a little more about your transition from teaching to also including coaching and your side projects. Can you give me a little more about when you started getting that feeling? You had mentioned before somebody had come to you and you were saying, okay, you're kind of echoing lessons from the past. We've been here before. But what did that really look like? When did you really start getting the feeling that you wanted to go from academia and also supplement it with this coaching?
Right. I suppose that if I had like a break moment, it was about maybe 3 years ago. And I don't remember the name of the company. And in any case, based on what I think about it, it's probably best if I don't say it, even though I could remember it. But a good friend of mine went to this training, and the training involved linking colors to personality types. And I said, oh, tell me, what does that involve? So she went and she explained this whole thing for 10, 15 minutes. And he's saying, oh, well, this person is, you take a test and it tells you like blue personality means you have these features, and you are supposed to interact in such a way with a person with yellow features. And so, and I'm sitting there thinking, I said, okay, I am barely grasping what you're telling me. I said, so how does that look? How does that, how does that play out when she goes, well, I don't know, because I met someone by chance a couple of days later. That person had also been trained in the system. And it turns out they didn't, they were supposed to not like each other, but they did, according to this. I said, well, okay, so I said, what about just going back to the basics of looking at this person as a fellow human and using simple techniques that we've known for millennia, and just, so what I found was that the system that she was, that she had gone through, it was so complex at the moment that you need it as to be used. It's like slowing her down. It's like, okay, I got to think now. I'm this type of personality. I ought to like this person. I ought not to like that person. I ought to have teams composed of this. I think by the time you go through all that, you're actually not dealing with the people who are in front of you. You're dealing with theory. So I started to give her some coaching with this sort of through the lens of history, and said, well, look, here's what some of the, our forefathers have said, Plato, or I don't remember the situation, Plato or Socrates or something. I said, okay, now following on from that, what do you think? And she said, okay, maybe this. And it worked. I guess that was the upshot. Whatever it was that we talked about, it worked and helped her solve that problem. And I thought, okay, maybe I can take this to people on a bigger scale. If it helps this individual, and I did it, quite casually with other students of mine, and they all seemed to like it. So I just took a plunge and said, okay, why not? Let's bring it out and see, systematize it and bring it out and see how we can help people.
Yeah, there's just the example that you give of the assessment. Everything has to be scientific. Everything has to be traced back to some kind of scientifically proven assessment instead of being like, just being a simple human.
Well, I have this thing, John, where I in the book, I start off with this point. I said, look, we've been around as a species for about 200,000 years. We have written history going back 5,000 years. That means 2.5% of our time on Earth is what we've got records for. So we as a modern species have been around for 97.5% of our existence is entirely unrecorded. But think about the challenges that we faced in that time. Surviving multiple ice ages, the exodus from Africa, the transition to farming, the encounters with, exotic animals and birds, tribes that are trying to hunt and kill you, the Neanderthal. So you've got these massive, tremendous leadership challenges that are entirely unrecorded because we didn't have writing. Now I'm thinking to myself, okay, imagine you go back and give one of these leaders in the Stone Age, one of these personality tests, and say, okay, look here, the person from the next tribe is a yellow personality. You've got. I said, if you imagine that leader who made the transition to farming, sort of laughing and saying, oh, okay, get out of here. I said, okay, probably you don't need it. Right? Probably there's something like they were using another technique that was simpler, easy to remember, and more effective. Right. So if we can move out of our African homeland and settle down and spread across the world and build cities, transition from hunter-gatherer, invent the wheel, do all these things, we had leaders doing that the whole time. They didn't just spontaneously come up from the ground. The people were leading us to those solutions. Right. So why don't we just copy what we can imagine that they did? Right? It seemed to have worked. The fact that we're all alive as a species is evidence that it worked. Right? So that's sort of the early approach I took from it.
Yeah. I mean, I love the breakdown that you just gave of time and how long we've been around and how long of it is actually recorded. Just because, we just overcomplicate everything. It just gets us in trouble. We overcomplicate everything. Our minds are just overstimulated throughout the day, and it just causes more confusion. So I like the idea of going back to a simpler, not a less valuable mind,
right?
But a simpler approach to, okay, what's the issue? How do we go about it? Because I'm fascinated by just how long our species has been around, and say in the last 16 years since social media, the world has just exponentially churned to just a different it's just a different level. So you're talking about millennia and millennia of, again, progress, right? Progress moving along. And then you bring something that just puts the world right in front of you, all around you. So right now I'm tapped into news from around the world, all of it, most of it negative, overstimulation. I'm overthinking instead of, I'm just fascinated. Mostly I'm fascinated by Maslow's hierarchy, just in terms of, in general, what I need to survive, and then everything that just kind of overcomplicates things.
Right.
It's just, it's fascinating to me.
One of the books I was going to talk about today briefly with you is this Living Latin book. And it has this quote in here that's sort of related to what we're talking about today. The author says, the anthropologist David Graeber once wrote about criticizing, and he quotes, the arrogant, unreflecting assumption which tells us we have nothing in common with 98% of people who ever lived, so we don't really have to think about them. Graeber was criticizing the ideas that modernity is something which happened at some point between the 17th and 19th centuries. And so anything before that we can just safely write off as not relevant. And he goes on to say that that's ridiculous, that we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
I mean, it's the foundation of who we are. This technology, the instant connection, social media, all, like me talking to you from Berlin, Connecticut to Berlin, overseas, those are nice to haves, but none of that happens without the foundation of everything that so many people have dismissed.
Right. Right.
That's the
Exactly.
true foundation. That's the true foundation of security, society building, all of it.
Right. Exactly.
Sean, to you, does it make sense from your childhood that this is what you're doing? I'm always fascinated by who somebody is as a kid and what they bring into their field, their specialization. So how do you reconcile that?
I think so. For many years, I was thinking, oh, maybe I ought to go and do the PhD and be an academic research historian, and that's the cutting edge, and that's where it's at. And I look at the people who are doing that, and they're doing good work, right? They're at the coalface, so to speak. But what I found was, for me, I didn't get the fulfillment, and that's the key word, the fulfillment from discovering some arcane fact and then knowing it for the sake of knowing it, and then putting it into a publication that's going to be read by 10 people, and then that's it. So I find a greater value in bringing that, with someone else's mind, bringing that into the wider sphere and finding a way to make it relevant so that we can bring it back into the world and help people today with that fact. So I would say yes, ultimately it does match with what I feel like I grew up with.
Sean, we've talked about in the last couple of minutes about leadership and examples of leadership, but is there anything else that I usually ask? What does leadership mean to you? But because
Mm-hmm.
we dove into it so much the first couple of minutes, is there anything you want to put out there or add to what we've already spoken about leadership and what it means to you?
Well, if I could, I would. I can talk about this book that has influenced me. It sort of answers that question. It's a recent publication, and what it is the author is talking about ancient monuments that had been put up by ordinary people, and I'll just give you a quote here, and I'll show you how this book helped me. So when anybody, doesn't have to be a leader, when you're looking at a book, you can buy a book these days and you can read it for its own sake. So a book on literature, a book on history, a book on Latin, however arcane that is. And if you read it through the lens of trying to extract a modern lesson, you will be enriched on two levels. One, on the level of the reason why you bought the book in the first place, but also on this leadership lesson. So I'll show you how if that's all right, I'll show you how I would use a book like this to
Absolutely.
produce a good leader today. Now, back in ancient Rome, they buried their people outside the city, and they inscribed, they carved onto stones a little story, and the stone was actually speaking to the person. So the stone will say something like, come here, read this, and there's some kind of lesson there. And so as you walk into the city of Rome, you've got miles of these stones, and they're basically gravestones, and it's the person who's buried there speaking to you, and they're revealing the essence of what they want you to remember about them. So we have one that's contained in this book, and we know nothing about this woman except her name, Claudia. She died about 2,000 years ago, and her stone says this. It says, "Stranger, my message is short. Stand by and read it through. Here is the unlovely tomb of a lovely woman. Her parents called her Claudia. She loved her husband with her whole heart. She bore 2 sons. Of these, she leaves one on earth. Under the earth has she placed the other. She was charming in conversation, yet proper in bearing. She kept house and she made wool. That's my last word. Go on your way." So it's like she's speaking to you. Now you think, okay, that's interesting from an archaeological point of view for many reasons, but it suddenly occurs to me, there's an interesting thing you can do here as a leader, and that is this. Write your own epitaph as a leader, right? Not as a person, not as, I love my family, I provided for my kids, or whatever the case was. The next bit, how do you want to be remembered as a leader? And now here's the trick. Write that out, and it's probably not going to be, I was a bastard, I squeezed my team like there were lemons, I increased profits by 1% in the third quarter. Yeah, no one's going to write that. They're going to write something more meaningful, right? So as uncomfortable as it is, do that. But here's the thing. Use a pen and paper. Don't use the computer. You want to have the personality written on the paper, right? Your personality. Then stage 2, give that to somebody, or maybe even your colleagues, and let them read it and say, okay, does this sound like me? And remember, this is your epitaph. This is the final word. And this is the word that is going to be the words by which you're going to be remembered, right? Now, here's the fun thing. Take those words now and pay $100 to a calligrapher and have that calligrapher write them out on a nice piece of parchment. Take it, frame it, and put it in your office.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you're faced with leadership challenges and you feel like, oh, I got to fly off the handle at this idiot I'm working with, or, this, let's just cut some corners and cheat or whatever, no one's looking, and you see your own words framed above your door, you're going to ask yourself, aren't you? am I living up to my own words? So it's not the corporate, slogans that you're living up to. It's not the motivational poster on the wall that, are generic. It's your engraved words about your epitaph. In other words, if you want to be remembered as a such and such leader, like this Roman woman wanted to be remembered for those qualities she had, then start acting like it now. Act now so that you deserve your own epitaph later. And if you put that over your door, and even more powerfully, perhaps, if you put it in a corridor and people walking by can see the standards to which you're holding yourself. Just like this stone was in public, and Romans coming into the city could see it as they went in. Can you see how powerful that is? Now I'm inspiring myself to live up to my own standards, right? And I'm not afraid to share it with my team. Right?
Sean, is it too personal to ask what your reminders are? Whether you have one like that or something else? What are the markers you have that you look at, that you see, that kind of constantly push you forward and remind you of who you want to be, who you are, the value you want to provide?
Yeah, actually, one of the things that I have, the whistle is one of them that I like to use for that reason. I also have, it's probably a bit long and off topic to go into, but I have this sculpture here. This is a 7th century BC abstract sculpture of a horse. And it embodies within it, it'll take us 45 minutes to go through it properly, but it embodies within it the essential elements of leadership. So what I do is I have this, wherever I am, here I am in this temporary flat for 2 weeks. So I've got this on my shelf and saying, oh, that's basically it, right? And so this, I would say, the horse sculpture is what I use.
So Sean, now we can dive into the 2 books. However you want to cover, there's 2 of them, however you want to cover them, in whatever order, however you want to dive in, please.
Well, the first one, I guess we already mostly covered, The Living Latin, which is just a fantastic example of how you can read a book that seems to have absolutely no connection to leadership whatsoever. And you can extract from that an interesting idea. And you're just looking at it. So I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, okay, here's an interesting material about ancient Rome. But all of this stuff is relevant for us today. And you can just, whatever book you're reading, the approach that I have is more of a sensibility, more than you've got to follow these 5 steps to achieve success. It's being sensible to how you can use interesting things to your benefit, right? So I suppose we can leave the Latin book to one side, having covered it. The other book that I read recently that I quite like is this thing here called the Greek Phalanx, the Greek Hoplite Phalanx. And the picture on top, it's very nice that they included that, because this encodes a huge number of leadership lessons. So it's a group of warriors with their shields going forward. And the thing about the Greek hoplite shield is that it has a peculiar design. It's concave, so it bulges out a couple of centimeters. It's not flat. Mm-hmm. And you put your arm through a center arm ring, is avoiding the technical terms, and you grab the handle on the rim. What that means is that the left side of your shield is sort of hanging out into space. It's useless. And your right side is open. So when you're fighting in a phalanx in the old days, you are contributing your own, sword arm, as it were, your spear arm, and you're making a contribution. But I'm vulnerable on my right side. So I am counting on and asking for and receiving with joy the help of the person on my right to cover my exposed side with his otherwise useless left side of his shield. Conversely, I'm offering help to my colleague on my left by covering his vulnerable right side with the left side of my shield. Mm-hmm. And that interlocking thing where you're contributing yourself, you're accepting help from your neighbor, and you're offering help to another neighbor. That sort of energy is at the essence of leadership, right? So that's one thing you can take from a book on that subject. The other thing is that the shield bulges out a little bit, as I mentioned. And this is an interesting thing that I think we really need to hear in the modern world, that in those days, when they clashed, the 2 phalanxes, 2 groups of men that were, 8, 10 people deep, would crash against each other, and they would push. So they're stabbing over this, the rim of the shield with the spear, but they were pushing each other against each other. Now, if you didn't have that convex shield, you would be crushed. Your rib cage would be crushed. You'd suffocate. You'd probably have a minute before you were done. So what that bulge in the shield does is it allows you to inhale. It allows you room for your chest to expand. So it prevents your chest from being crushed, and it allows you to breathe in that crush. And here's the interesting thing. What that means is we need in the modern world a built-in structure where we give people the chance to take a breath. And we don't have that anymore, right? Taking a vacation is a weakness. Going home at 5 o'clock is a weakness. Not working on the weekends is a weakness. Sitting on the train and looking out the window instead of working is a weakness, right? And that's rubbish. What is necessary is to build into our companies this facility wherein you can take a breath, right? Because taking a breath is not an optional extra. It's the thing that's keeping you alive. It's the thing that's keeping you in the front ranks. If you can't take the breath, you can't do the job, right? So if someone needs to take a mental health day, or their kid is sick and they need to take a day off to go and deal with it, give it to them without pressuring them, without the guilt trip. Encourage your people to take vacations, right? It's not bad. It's the opposite. It's necessary. And when I look at an ancient Greek phalanx, like it's written about in this book here, I'm reminded of the fact that the essence of leadership is contained within that image, right? It's the built-in structural ability to take a break and to rest. It's the built-in structural enshrining of the notion that you are contributing something yourself, but you're also accepting and offering help. And it's in that cohesion that you become unbeatable, right? It's not squeezing people like a lemon. It's not pushing on at all hours. You see, that's the idea.
You broke that down beautifully. So why such a big book? What is in there? How does that author break out the story of the phalanx? Like, what goes into that book? What can people find?
So what this guy's done is, to be fair, it's for people who are quite interested in it as an archaeological topic. So he's looking at the different shield devices and so on. So if you bring the picture up again, so this is not a particularly great one, but they're all different birds, and there's a turtle in there or something, and here's a gorgon on the side. So he goes into, what does this mean in terms of where these people came from and how can we identify them and this kind of thing. But again, like, you can buy a book like this if you're interested in learning something new about ancient history. But again, it relates to the modern life in so many ways. Another thing, while we're on that topic, John, the thing that's interesting about the shield devices is that they allowed each person in the team to identify as an individual. Right, so these were family heralds, or these were, the apotrophaic devices. They were called to turn away bad things from you. In any case, it was an individual sign. So there's no problem, there's no contradiction in being a part of a team yet maintaining your own independence, right? Your own identity. You're not subsuming one. And in fact, because the phalanx fought so close together, there was a danger that you would subsume your identity into the identity of the group. And that's how fascism worked in the 20th century. Where you get people in such a mass that the group takes on its own identity and its own character, and you now hand over your ability to think for yourself to the group. So by keeping these individual shield devices in place, what the Greek phalanx is reminding us is that you need to keep an individual. You need to be individual, right? Within the context of the group. It's a perfect balance between group identity and working as a team, but also keeping your individuality so that you don't succumb to what today we would call fascism, right? Of course, they didn't have that term back then. So the phalanx is just so, whatever thing you want to talk about in that ancient organization, there's something that's relatable to the modern business world.
Sean, and then the other book, is there anything that you wanted to cover in there? Living Latin. I know you gave the example of the tombstone. Is there anything else that people could pull out of that? Is it various stories of that nature?
He's got various stories. Yeah, exactly. He's got various ways of connecting how people communicated in the old days with how they do it today. So probably nothing immediately obvious about leadership, other than to say that when you look at the accumulated stories in a book like that, the jokes, the humor, the people falling down steps, and it's, they do it in such a way that it's funny and so on. Again, you're making the point that what connects us to antiquity or the Middle Ages is more than what separates us. Like some of the, imagine that as somebody wrote a joke 2,000 years ago, and now today you're laughing at it, right? And it reminds you that, again, as we started off the conversation, we've been here before. We're all people, right? So don't be afraid of asking the past for help, if you need to, as well as your current colleagues.
Sean, how would you go about teaching history differently than it might be taught to students today, like grade school students?
Hmm.
I remember, being in school at a young age and going to history class, not enjoying it because
Hmm.
it was seemingly very boring
Right,
stories, history.
right, right.
As I become an adult and I hear these things, read about them at my age, now I look at it differently.
Hmm.
Because I've been through life. I've suffered my losses. I've had my wins. I've faced my obstacles. I've been taken down by challenges. Once you've gone through life, you can look back at history and say, okay, now I get it. Now it makes sense. Now I
Hmm.
get its applicability. How do you speak to like the way history is taught when you're younger? I mean, do you believe that it should be, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, but do you believe they should be taught with these kind of lessons in mind so that they do stick? Because for me, it was a grade. I just got to remember that this war happened in this year for
Hmm.
this reason. This was the general. That's it. It was a checkbox. I'll be honest.
Right,
Again, a
right,
deeper appreciation for it now.
right.
Do you think they should be teaching it when they have with corresponding lessons? So it's not just a story, but a lesson for your life that there is a reason, there is a possibility, an opportunity for you to draw lessons
Hmm.
from your life from these stories that aren't boring, that you can
Hmm.
draw something valuable from them.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different ways to approach this, but I would say the following: if you uh, approach history as the names and dates of battles and kings, it would be like me describing you in terms of your height,
Hmm.
how long your beard is, what kind of clothes you like. That's not the point of you, right? To put it bluntly, right? Your height is not you, right? The fact you have X number of bones in your body is an important fact. If you didn't have those bones in your body, you wouldn't be you. But that's not you, right? So the way I would approach it is this: the word history itself is a Greek word, and it means inquiry. It means investigation. So history is just the act of inquiring. It's making an investigation. That's it. So we have the word history as a noun, but it ought to be a verb. It really ought to be. It's something you do. And well, let me ask you this question: what in your mind, what is the difference between the past and history?
Uh, Similar to what you just said, the way you just put it, where to me, the past is kind of a collection of what's happened, where history is looking for the stories. So
Right.
the
Exactly.
past is maybe just a recording of what's happened, and history
Right.
is capturing the essence, capturing, um, yeah, the past is just kind of bland, where history's richer.
Right. So I would say exactly as you said. I would say the past is factually what happened. So we can compare it to the English past tense, right? So I ate breakfast at 9 o'clock. Just a fact. Okay. History is what we do with that information. It's picking
Mm,
out facts, and it's like the present perfect in English, right? So I have eaten. I have eaten is a present tense. It references the past, but it's about the future. I have eaten, so now we can go to work. I'm going to do something now.
mhm.
So what I would do when I'm teaching kids is to say, don't look at history as something to memorize, right? Unless you like that. Look at it as an investigation. You're asking questions. Like when kids go around when they're very young and saying, why is the sky blue? Why is this? Why is that? That they're doing history. They're inquiring. And they're taking stuff that happened before and they're making it relevant now. How is it going to help you now? Right? That's all it is. And so finding out the nuances and the details about the past is just making sure that you've got the correct raw material to draw from. But what matters is what lesson you're drawing from it, right? And if it's going to help you, then that's great. Like, for example, if we looked at that woman, Claudia, the ancient Roman woman, that's the only thing we know about her.
Yeah.
But imagine the power of this, right? This woman has been dead for 2,000 years. We know nothing about her. And here we are in the year 2024 talking about her and using her stone as an inspiration for today's leaders. And maybe one of your listeners or a couple of your listeners will take my advice and write their business epitaph. Imagine that if you could go back in time and tell her that's the effect that she's having. 2,000 years, people are still talking about this. I mean, it's great, but we're using it today for us. Right? We're not going and saying, "Oh, this we're going to reflect on the nature of life in the Roman Empire and blah blah blah." It's okay. How are we going to take her example and use it to make our lives better? Right?
Yeah, that it can be a gift. It's not just a factual recording of events, but it's like, what can you pull forward? What can you draw? I mean,
Yeah.
very much like the conversation we've had and everything you've shared. Sean, so based on your history, your experience, your work, your interests, you don't have to give away the store, but can you give us kind of a synopsis of what your book is going to focus on when it comes out?
Yeah, it's going to be exactly this type of thing. I'm just going to take a series of objects, encode them, if you will, with certain leadership lessons, and then suggest that people acquire one of these objects or something similar and stick that. So the way I look at it is it's sort of like a vademecum, in the old sense of the word. So it's a thing you dip into and say, okay, I'm all right with this material, but yeah, I need to work on that thing. So here's an object for you. Right, and here's the interesting little history bit to get you excited about it. But really, this is how we're going to use it. Is like this, right? Much like I did with the whistle, right? Just fleshing it out a bit more. That's it. And so by the end of the book, they've got a dozen and a half objects that they can pull from. I talk a lot about the difference between leadership and management. Comparing it to airplanes. So an airplane pilot is a perfect example of both management and leadership. So when you go through a checklist as a pilot, you're managing. So have we moved all these switches in the correct positions? Have we done everything in the right order? Tick, 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 tick. Leadership is deciding whether you should take off or not because there's a storm front coming in. So if you're not comfortable with making the decision to fly or stay, then you're not a leader. Right? Leadership is what happens in periods of ambiguity, when the road is not clear, when you're looking at a chart of the open sea, right? Go left or go right. What do you do? So uncertainty is where leadership lives, right? So I talk about that and use the analogy of a nautical chart to drive that point home. Things like that.
And Sean, for you, who are obviously being committed to history, its lessons, working with leaders today, because you are, much more versed in it than I am, or most people I know, who are the leaders of history that stand out to you as the greats?
I would say the people who went into a situation of great uncertainty and then used, I suppose I would call it authenticity to move forward. So an example of that would be Admiral Nelson, the British admiral. He never tried to be anything that he wasn't. But when he gathered his captains together before his final battle at Trafalgar, he presented them with a plan, and he basically said, look, here's the idea. And he asked for their opinions. What do you think? But not in the weak sense of like, I don't know, guys, what do you think? Is this good about? He's saying, this is my idea. This is why I think it'll work. Now give me your input. Right? So it was confidence, but also basically, if you think about it, asking for alternative views if that's necessary. And as far as communication was concerned, he said, look, without going into the whole history of it, but communication was a difficult thing at sea in the 18th century. So he basically, much like with the trench whistle, he had his captains' backs. He said to them, look, your careers will not suffer if all else is lost, if you're confused, if you can't see the flagship, if you can't understand the signals I'm giving, if you just get your vessel alongside that of an opponent and fight, you'll be fine. I've got your back. And that was the key component. That was what separated him from the commanders that had gone before in the last century and a half of naval warfare, where they were following these rigid, regulations, and they had to do this and this and stay in the line of battle and never break out from it and blah blah blah. So he was giving them he was giving them the minimum that he needed, right? And he was telling them that I've got your backs ahead of time, and I want also your input into this plan. And that, I think, is the recipe. If you take away just those key points, you're going to be already well advanced on the road, right, to doing it, right?
Yeah, it's amazing how simple it can be.
Yeah. And you think this is a man who's got a statue on top of this, column in Trafalgar Square in London. Here we are 200 years later, and he's still, honored. Why? It's not because the naval battles he won were so crucial that, they've changed the face of the world we live in, even to this day. No, it was because he led in this innovative way. He trusted his team. He worked with his team. His leadership was about the team, his band of brothers, as they called them. And it was that component. And that was compelling enough. And it has remained compelling enough for that statue to still exist today.
Sean, you watch football at all?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Okay. No, just because I think those and I'm by football I mean soccer, depending on where you speak about it. But
Right.
I've seen, and people have seen me write about this, but I've seen just an amazing example of in European in the English Premier League.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the manager of Liverpool, Jurgen Klopp, is
Mm-hmm.
leaving. This was his last season,
Mm-hmm.
and just the respect, the reverence that he gets from people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's something that's going around online. I think it is accurate, but it says Sky Sports was reporting that more people were watching his last game in celebration, like 60%, 61% of the population versus 23% of the population watching the actual team that won the league. That the all the
Mm-hmm.
games, the last games were taking place simultaneously. One won
Mm-hmm.
the championship, and the other channel had this guy leaving. And they're saying most people were watching him. That there's just something about him,
Mm-hmm.
the way, and I know what it is. I mean, I know to me what stands out is how he treats his players, even physically, hugging them, caressing them
Mm-hmm.
like sons. How he
Mm-hmm.
goes up to the players on the other team after the game,
Mm-hmm.
like that. It's not just a checkbox of good game, good game, good game. That you could tell he's putting
Mm-hmm.
his heart into it.
Right.
So that's the one. It's tough because you haven't watched it, but there's just something about his demeanor that makes you want to get behind him because you see the commitment that he
Mm-hmm.
has for his players.
Right.
That they don't seem like they're pawns, like almost like maybe it shouldn't be that way, but the best comparison I can draw is these are my sons. I have to make sure that I'm doing right
Mm-hmm.
by them, that I'm
Mm-hmm.
developing them. I have to
Mm-hmm.
hold them accountable. If anybody
Mm-hmm.
comes after them, they have to come through me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's the story that comes out, is because he just puts himself out there alongside his players, and if
Mm-hmm.
that stat is correct, the one that I mentioned, it makes perfect sense because you see the commitment he has to each and every player when he sends them onto the field, when he receives a sub from off the field, like the way he hugs them and like caresses their head, and it's just
Mm-hmm.
very it's very familial. So it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting that you bring up um and what stood out was that you said, listen, this guy, and I apologize, I forgot his name. He's got a statue up, you
Nelson.
know,
Mm-hmm.
this public statue. Meanwhile, he
Mm-hmm.
wasn't anybody that had the highest tally of wins or whatever it may be. So that reminded me of Klopp in terms of
Mm-hmm.
he won some trophies, but the other team, they won, the other team won like three. Klopp's won 1 year, and then the other team
Mm-hmm.
won like four. So the other
Mm-hmm.
one has all the wins, has the
Mm-hmm.
dominance, but there's something
Mm-hmm.
about the way he treats his staff, his team, the
Mm-hmm.
community. It's just very genuine, very authentic, and you can tell, as much as you can glean from watching it, that it's not a facade, it's not a checkbox. That he
Yeah.
really, you can tell that he has heart, I guess, is what it comes down to.
And it's authenticity, and that's the same with Nelson. So Nelson actually won pretty much all of his battles.
Okay.
But the point I was making is that the results of the battle don't matter anymore, and they haven't for many years. What's remembered is the fact that he cared about his people,
Yeah.
and he led
Yeah.
through them. He was a servant. His leadership was a service,
Yeah.
right? It wasn't about him. And he lost an arm, he lost an eye in combat. So people knew that he was there sharing, and he was
Yeah.
walking the quarter deck with that. He was sharing the danger. The same point I make with the trench whistle, right? So
Yeah.
he's got your back, and he's sharing the danger with you, and it's about us. It's not about me. That's it. And you just think, okay, just take a picture of Nelson, take a picture of his trench whistle, and that's it. Boom, you're done. You've got the essential core thing. Now the trick is as you move forward in your daily life, making sure to cast your eye on these objects and just have a little interaction in your mind. And it can be subconscious. You're just interacting with the object subconsciously.
Yeah.
To keep it fresh, I think you should move the object around your office every month. So it's
Yeah.
not in the
Yeah.
same place. Yeah. But other than that, you're still, it's catching your eye, and you're essentially coaching yourself through these objects.
Yeah. A deep realization I've had of leadership as I studied it, as I went into coaching, was just appreciating the environment that person left behind.
Mm-hmm.
So when I step away, what kind of environment have I set? What kind of trust have I left in you?
Mm-hmm.
How have I empowered and encouraged you that when I step away, most of that will continue as much as possible? So yeah, he was the manager for my team that I cheer for.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't win the league, but there's just something about his demeanor and what he infuses in that team that
Mm-hmm.
you can't buy that. It's not, for me, it's not better than a win. Like, you really just saw humanity on display.
Right.
And it really demonstrated to me, like, wow, you don't see this humanity and leadership that often. Like,
Yeah.
we're typically doing a job, but you don't see that humanity, that
Mm-hmm.
support that often. So to me, that's what stands out the most. So I just draw a parallel
Well,
between the
it's spot
story.
on. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
absolutely accurate. And
Yeah.
compare that with the story of the guy I started off our discussion with, who took his sports tickets and basically told his staff to go screw themselves, keep working. I'm going to go and enjoy the the privileges of being at the top, and that's it. It's the opposite in every way, you know. And what's going to
Completely.
happen is you know, long after this guy has retired, you're not going to remember that on such and such a day his team won by 2 points to whatever. You're going to remember the hugging and the support, and that's going to live on now in your leadership. And crucially, I would suggest when you're coaching your clients, it's that point is going to somehow come through,
Absolutely.
and you see it now. That's the material that's spreading.
Yes, absolutely. Even though it happened just this past weekend, it's something from my past, from my history, his
Yeah, it's
history,
all history already now. Yeah,
whatever's
yeah.
public canon that I can draw from.
Yeah, exactly. Bingo. It doesn't have to be 2,000 years ago. It could be yesterday. Still the past.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sean, so is there anything that I might have missed? What are you up to today? Anything that you want to share that I might not have asked you about that you want to share with this audience, please?
No, just go out there and look for leadership wherever you can find it, leadership lessons wherever you can find it. So just because you are reading a, you know, I don't know, a Stephen King novel, or you're reading about football, or you're reading about the ancient Romans, and you know, you're thinking, oh, I feel guilty, I should be reading a self-help book. No, you can extract leadership lessons from everything that you're reading. So you're getting a double
Yeah,
purpose, right? That's, I guess, the point I wanted to make to you today, is every book that you read, no matter how distant superficially it is from the topic of leadership or modern business,
absolutely.
absolutely everything will help you if you have the I don't know the word to use, sensibility. I'm not sure I like it, but that
Yeah,
gets
yeah,
us in the right
yeah.
direction.
Like, you have to
Um,
be attuned to
Attune to it. Yeah,
finding.
that's it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So once you learn to attune yourself to look for that message, uh, you get these fantastic things. And you know, you were talking briefly about, you know, your own coaching and how you're bringing that out into, you know, using the football. That's, you're already halfway to writing your Claudia style epitaph. If you wrote down the words that you were saying to me, you could just, you know, tweak them here and there for the grammar,
Oh
and that's already,
yeah.
you're halfway to the epitaph now.
I'm not, I'm not blowing smoke. That, I love that concept. I love that idea of drafting something like that, finalizing it, and then having somebody write it out beautifully and framing that. I think that's a
Yeah,
good reminder because it came from you. It comes from what you wanted. You put thought into it, and it's a constant
yeah,
reminder. You know, we're not at the top of our game, the top of our motivation every day, day in, day out. So that's a solid reminder to have something like
yeah.
that. So that's an exercise I'll definitely put to use.
Yeah, and imagine if you put it, you know, on your wall behind your head, and you know, people are looking at it with you, and you know, they've clocked that it's there. You may have talked about it. It's not like restricting you, like, oh, I have to follow this thing, because it came from you.
Yes.
It's you. So it's that
I think I would
vulnerability.
see it more like as a North Star, like a
Yeah,
general
exactly,
direction you want to head
exactly,
in. Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Sean, if you want, why don't you give the title of your upcoming book and more or less when you believe it'll be out? I mean, whenever you post something online about it's being out, I'll share. But if you could, if you do have the working title,
I don't have a working title yet, because that's the hardest
okay.
part of writing the book. Is to find the three
Yeah,
words that summarize the whole thing.
yeah.
So
Yeah, but you'll
that's the
be
only
back
part I
on
haven't
here
written.
anyway. As
Yeah,
we get closer
exactly.
to the book coming out, you'll be back on here. We'll share then.
Right.
But in the meantime, the two books that Sean covered are The Greek Hoplite Phalanx, The Iconic Heavy Infantry of the Classical Greek World by Richard Taylor. And the other book was Living Latin by Charlie Kerrigan. And Sean, thank you so much for sitting down with me for this conversation. This is
Thank you
great.
for having me. Yeah, I had a great time. Thanks very much.
It was awesome. If there's anything I might have missed, anything I should have asked Sean, my mind's always racing in different directions. We're limited on time, but let me know. I'll reach out to him, see what kind of insights, curiosity, knowledge, wisdom I can glean. Again, he'll be back on in the next couple months when his book comes out. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.
All right.